We'll let them come on in. Welcome, everyone, to the 34th Annual Benjamin E. Mays Lecture, hosted by the Alonzo A. Krim Center for Urban Educational Excellence and the College of Education and Human Development here at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Brian Williams, and I currently serve as the director of the Krim Center, and it's my pleasure, my honor, to open this year's lecture. This lecture series for the past 3 decades has served as an invaluable space for the dissemination of innovative ideas, radical visions for our world, and critical questions, all related to public education and its potential to transform our world and the lives of our children. This lecture series was started in 1989 by Dr. Alonzo Krim, the Mays chair at the time. Dr. Krim had been recruited to Atlanta only 15 years earlier by Dr. Benjamin E. Mays. He was recruited to serve as the first person of color to lead a major school district after the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. After serving for 15 years as superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools, Dr. Krim joined the faculty here at Georgia State University, and in 1988 established the Benjamin E. Mays Chair. Shortly after that, in 1989, he launched the lecture series, and the first lecturer that year was Dr. Charles B. Willey of Harvard University. Following Dr. Willey are names that you'll probably recognize. People like Dr. Vanessa Siddle-Walker, Brian Stevenson, Adelaide Sanford, Maynard Jackson, and last year's speaker, Dr. William Tate. This year, we have the pleasure of listening to the genius of Dr. Naila Nasir. So if we were together in our auditorium like we usually are, there'd be thunderous applause right now. It doesn't translate quite as well on Zoom. But we're really excited that you're here and that she's here today. Before we start, I want to make sure I take a little bit of time and thank the people that made tonight possible. First, I want to thank Georgia State University and the leadership of Georgia State University, our President Blake, and our Provost, Nicole Parsons-Pollard. I also want to thank the leadership of the College of Education, most specifically our Dean, Dr. Paul Alberto, and our Associate Dean, Dr. Deshonda Patterson. All the emails that you all received, all the news that you received about this lecture series was made possible by our communications team, Angela Turk and Claire Miller. And technical assistants this year, the people behind the scenes that are making this happen, are the Atlanta Film Society and their leader, Chris Escobar. So thank you to all of them. And finally, I want to thank three very, very special groups, so two special people in one special group. First, I want to thank our Benjamin E. Mays Chair, Dr. Joyce King. To know Joyce is to learn from Joyce. That's what I say. And those that know her understand that to be true. She's a preeminent scholar who gives of her time and her treasure, not only to people here at Georgia State, but to communities around the world. And we are honored, we are blessed to have her as a part of our community. Second, I want to thank Dr. Naila Nasir. We've had a couple of conversations, a few conversations leading up to this lecture series, and I've had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Nasir, and I know that all of you are in for a treat tonight. I encourage you to listen closely. You will be challenged, you will be inspired. Dr. Nasir, we thank you for the work that you're doing as the lead of the Spencer Foundation and as a member of our community, those of us that are working hard to transform our world and our schools for our children. And finally, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank you all are the living embodiment of what Dr. Krim called the community of believers. This was a community of individuals who were committed, regardless of their professional status, regardless of the community that they lived in. They were all committed to excellence in public education, as it was evident for all of our children. They believed that all of our children were capable of learning, that we were capable of creating wonderful schools for our children. And that's who you all are. And I thank you for being with us tonight. So with that being said, welcome once again to the 34th Benjamin E. Mays Lecture. We're happy that you're here. So next, you're going to hear from a couple of people. Our provost, Nicole Parsons-Pollard, is going to bring greetings from the university. After her, you'll hear from Dean Paul Alberto, who will bring greetings from the college. And following our dean will be our Mays Chair, Dr. Joyce King, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Good evening. I bring you greetings on behalf of President Blake and the more than 62,000 students, faculty, and staff of Georgia State University. I'm delighted to join you for the 34th Annual Benjamin E. Mays Lecture. Right now, Georgia State is forming its vision for the next decade as we enter into our strategic planning process. We are well known for student success, and we are continuing to build upon that. And our work has become a national model for many colleges and universities. The Krim Center is also a prime example of another part of our strategic priorities, building our identity and sense of place by being a part of and not just in our community. To set the tone tonight, I wanted to share with you a quote from Dr. Mays' eulogy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And his speech reminds us when he says, "No man is ahead of his time. Every man is within his star, each in his time." I want to tell you tonight, this is our time. This is your time. And I challenge each of you this evening to listen very closely to Dr. Nasir. Participate in the greater discussion, reflect, and determine the ways in which you can be the change that you'd like to see in the world. I want to say thank you again for being here. And now I'm going to hand the program over to Dean Paul Alberto. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parsons-Pollard. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and a particular welcome to you, Dr. Nasir, and thank you for joining us this evening in our college. The stated goal of the Spencer Foundation research grants is to support rigorous and intellectually ambitious research that is relevant to the most pressing questions and opportunities in education. The foundation values work that fosters creative scholarship, engages in deep inquiry, and examines compelling questions related to education, hopefully for a lasting impact on policy and practice. We appreciate that the foundation recognizes that learning occurs across the course of one's life, as well as across settings, from the classroom to the workplace, to family and community contexts, any of which may provide the basis for study that makes significant contributions to the field. It has the expectation that proposals span a range of topics, disciplines, and methodologies. These guidelines of the foundation align with the mission of our college and its interdisciplinary faculty. Our mission being that as part of an urban research university, our faculty, students, and staff conduct research that addresses challenges found in classrooms, clinical settings, families, and communities, particularly those challenges that stem from intergenerational poverty. We strive to provide research-based solutions to those challenges that also promote social justice and equity in educational and human service settings. We appreciate and are proud that in our college, there is a history of Spencer Foundation funded research, some of which include research into academic skills such as narrative writing pedagogy for middle schoolers, and the development of writing skills for young children in their association with reading. The role of early language and academic English in the reading comprehension of middle school deaf and hard of hearing children. Examinations of the interactions between online and in-person explanation strategies used by students that demonstrate their science comprehension. A social learning examination of how individuals develop learning leadership skills, and a community-wide partnership for school readiness and achievement across public and private agencies in our metropolitan area. This funding from the Spencer Foundation generously contributes to our college being recognized as one of the top 10 funded research colleges of education in the country by the National Science Foundation. So within this context, once again, welcome Dr. Nasir, as we thank you for the partnership we have enjoyed, and as we welcome your thoughts on learning, leadership, and educational research.
Good evening to the provost and Dean, our Dean Alberto. I'm Joyce King, and I have the pleasure of introducing to some, presenting to others, our 34th Mays lecturer, Dr. Naila Nasir. In 2017, Naila Suad Nasir became the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation. She was a faculty member of the University of California, Berkeley from 2008 to 2017, and she was elected as the 2nd UC Berkeley Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion in 2015. She holds the Bourgeois Chair in Educational Disparities in the Graduate School of Education and was previously the H. Michael and Jean Williams Chair of African American Studies. Dr. Nasir joined the Berkeley faculty in 2008 from the School of Education at Stanford University, where she had earned the St. Clair Drake Teaching Award in 2007. She is the author of Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement for African American Youth, published by the Stanford University Press in 2011. Her research examines the racialized and cultural nature of learning and schooling and political She is interested in the cultural nature of learning and schooling. She's interested in the intertwining of social, cultural, and political contexts and learning, especially in connection with inequity in educational outcomes. Dr. Nasir also published over 30 articles in scholarly journals. I'm sure it's higher than that now. And in 2017, she was elected to membership in the National Academy of Education. The National Academy of Education advances high-quality education research and its use in policy and practice. Dr. Nasir has also been an integral member of the UC Berkeley Resident Faculty Program, where faculty integrate themselves into student life and provide support for students by living alongside them in the residence halls. In this role, she worked with resident faculty colleagues to promote academic achievement and to create an inclusive and comfortable community that encourages personal growth and development. She strives to integrate her scholarly work with her commitment to community and engaged scholarship. She received her BA in 1993 from UC Berkeley, the Social Welfare and Psychology program, and her PhD in 2000 from UCLA in Psychological Studies in Education. She served formally as president of the American Educational Research Association from 2021 to 2022. And I would like to remind everyone, if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A box. And it's my pleasure again to welcome Dr. Nasir. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. I feel very warmly welcomed. Thank you to campus leadership and Joyce. And I'm gonna see if I can figure out how to share these slides. Okay, great. You all are seeing the slides, right? Okay, it says participants can now see your application. I'm gonna go with the yes. This is, I haven't given a Zoom talk in a while. It's quiet. But I'm just gonna imagine an auditorium full of people nodding and smiling and with me. I'm really, really honored to be here and in deep appreciation for this invitation. Thank you, Joyce and Brian, for inviting me and for making it such a wonderful experience. And thank you to the students I met with earlier for your great energy and wonderful ideas. And I am also in appreciation for the school and university leadership that for your presence tonight and for your kindness and support. And thank you all for coming and logging on and being with us tonight. And I am especially pleased that we're gathered tonight together in honor of the man this lectureship is named for, Benjamin Mays. One thing that has struck me in the conversations that Joyce and Brian and I had in preparing for this talk is the deep rootedness of this community in region in Georgia in the South. And I'm not from the South, I'm from California, but like many Black folks in this country, my family came to California via the South, in my case, Shreveport, Louisiana. And the South as a context is both a setting in which Black people in this country have experienced deep and profound oppression, and a context which has sparked greatness and innovation and hope. And education in the South has continued to reproduce educational experiences that are vastly unequal, as has happened in every region of the country and the globe. But it is also the context that Vanessa Sider Walker writes about, where Black schools have a long legacy of being connected to community, where there was a deep love and desire for education, and where Black students thrived in spite of these legacies of oppression. And it was in the context of the South that Benjamin Mays hailed from, where he built and stewarded an institution of higher education dedicated to the unapologetic education of Black people. And we all know his major accomplishments, especially his work at Morehouse, making the institution into the legacy it is today by growing the endowment, revamping the curriculum, hiring new faculty, et cetera. But what I find most fascinating about him is that his legacy and his work in education was rooted in spirit and in spiritual mission. It's what sustained him. and what gave him his center and sense of purpose. It's what allowed him to create new possibilities out of nothing and withstand incredible headwinds as he did so. He did the things he felt were his to do, even though they were virtually unimaginable at the time that he did them. And so I start with this incredible sense of mission rooted in the spiritual commitment to building something important and serving his people, to creating new possibility. Because in many ways, this talk is about my much smaller version of what it means to build something important and create new possibility. The title of my talk today is Learning is Lifelong and Life-Wide, Reflections on Learning, Leadership, and Education Research. And I'm gonna maybe pre-warn you, it's a bit of a pondering kind of a talk, focused on learning from several angles. What I've learned about learning and its connection to culture and community in my work as a scholar, how learning is at the heart of my leadership journey as president of Spencer and before that, and what we need to learn, how we need to learn to reach for something more in our work as a research community moving forward. So hopefully the links between those things work well enough. Okay, now let's see if I can on these multiple machines. So this slide comes from a collaborative research effort that I was involved in early in my career. It's called the Life Center, which stood for Learning in Formal and Informal Environments, which brought together neuroscientists, learning scientists who studied informal learning, and scholars who were working on the designs for learning in classrooms to do collaborative work and to learn from each other. It's a $50 million center, so an incredible scope and scale of work over 10 years, funded by the National Science Foundation. And this slide illustrates what we used to call at Life, the sea of blue. So the graphic shows the percentage of our lives that we spend in school versus the time we spend in our lives outside of school in the sea of blue here. And what it illustrates is that while learning is pervasive, school constitutes a relatively small part of our waking lives, and even less so over time. And I wanted to open with this for two reasons. One, this notion of learning in the sea of blue is critical to framing what we've come to understand about learning in the learning sciences and its deep rootedness in culture and community. In other words, we know that learning happens everywhere, all the time, and consequential learning happens as people go about their daily lives with one another. I'll say more about that. But two, this center was a formative experience of collaboration for me. Collaboration across disciplines and across methods. It was led initially by the late John Bransford. John passed last year. And it taught me the power of people thinking collectively about a set of challenges or issues and bringing multiple disciplinary and methodological lenses to bear. And as such, it formed an early insight that shows up in my work today. And I think you'll see the thread as I share. So my talk today is going to focus on three things, which I'm going to take up in three acts, because acts don't tie that closely to one another sometimes. So 3 acts. Act 1, what we know about learning from an intellectual and scholarly perspective. Act 2, what I've kind of learned about learning from a leadership perspective. And Act 3, the learning journey we are on as a field in education research. And for each, I'm going to take up a few key questions. So Act 1, learning from an intellectual and scholarly perspective. And here I'm going to focus on what we know about learning. And learning is how humans adapt to the environment, right? It's rooted in the very basics of what it means to be human. And I'm going to consider here, what is learning and how do we understand and account for learning in ways that honors it as a natural human activity connected to culture and community. So this part of the talk is just kind of some snippets and then a bit of a summary. It was tough to think about how to encapsulate 15 years of research as 1/3 of a talk for 40 minutes, so bear with me. So this slide starts at the beginning of my career of studying learning. It comes from my very first study on learning, which was a study of high school basketball players. And the study focused on the mathematical learning that occurred in league basketball for middle and high school African-American students. It involved two components. So in the first, I observed league basketball play for about 8 months to understand how and when mathematics came up in the cultural practice of basketball and how mathematical problems got solved. And I guess I should back up a little bit and say part of what I was after in this early work was a lot of what I had been reading in graduate school about learning positioned Black students and other students of color as having deficits, is what they couldn't learn and what they couldn't do, and how the achievement test showed that they were behind. And if you looked at the reading levels, they were this grade levels behind it. And I wanted to do work that looked at where learning was happening. And I knew from my own experience that learning in school wasn't for learning. And some of the smartest guys I knew in high school were out on the corner at that time selling crack. And so how do we conceptualize learning apart from achievement in school? So that's part of what I was after. So anyway, this study looked at basically how basketball players thought about mathematics when you were talking about the game of basketball and when you were looking at doing the mathematics in a more standard kind of school-based way. And so this is a summary of one player's answers that shows when I asked him problems in a school format, how he solved them, and when I asked him problems in a basketball format, how he solved them. So I'm just going to go that first line where the problem is about calculating an average. And I say, you're standing at the free throw line, you take 11 shots and you make 7 of them. What's your percentage from the line? He says, about 65%, because you made most of your shots, so it was kind of almost high. So he lands on a number that actually conceptually and mathematically is quite appropriate. But when he's asked to do the same problem on a school worksheet, he starts using formulas and misremembers the formula and misplaces the decimal point and comes up with 0.63%, which actually conceptually doesn't make any sense. And so you can see this through his pattern of responses, and you can actually see it through the pattern of responses of the entire group that I studied. And what the study showed is that thinking is contextual, that we make sense of the world through our everyday experiences. And while our knowledge is generalizable, it is not always generalized. And there's a key moment in the study that led to the next set of studies that I did that focused on identity, which was, there was one student who I had given the basketball set of problems to, and then I turned to the school set of problems. And at that point in the interview, he kind of like slunk down in his seat and looked over at me and said, no, I'm not really good at school math. And I was like, no, it's fine. We're going to just talk about, the percentages like we've been talking about. And he said, okay, I'll be right back. I'm gonna go get a pencil. And he never returned. I thought this kid who would answer these questions, these mathematical questions with great conceptual clarity, somehow didn't see himself as a mathematical thinker outside of that context, which led me to the thought that this isn't about mathematical thinking at all. This is about identity. And this is about the connection between how we see ourselves and how we engage learning settings around us and the world around us, and how we engage knowledge, which led to a set of studies and kind of a theory about this relationship between learning and identity. And I spent a good number of years over the course of my career trying to work this out in my head, and came to conceptualize learning and identity as processes that constitute one another. As one learns, one's identity in a context or with content is deepened, and that deepening of identity leads to more learning. But the inverse is also true, right? As one struggles or fails to learn, the connection with that context becomes disrupted, and there are kind of off ramps in this cycle. Another early study that I moved to as I started thinking about identity, because it led me to this question. It's kind of obvious why young people, and especially young people of color, struggle sometimes to build identities as learners in school. But if these out-of-school contexts, like basketball or like dominoes, which I also studied, are so good at building learners and learning identities, how do they do it? What does that learning look like? And so to answer that question, I conducted a study of a high school track and field team with this coach, His name is Jamal Cooks. Was an amazing, amazing coach who built these deep and abiding relationships with the young people. And I've written about this moment that I felt gave me some really deep insight into this identity construction process in the sport of track and field. And I'm not going to play the video, but there's a transcript there. And the context is there's a young woman who's a track athlete who is actually kind of an accidental track athlete. She's there on the team because her brother was on the team and her mom was like, you need an activity too, and I'm not driving to two places, so track it is for you, which is significant because she wasn't invested in track itself. And she was a little reluctant. And the coach saw her, he put them through various exercises and kind of ascertain what they would be good at. And so if you're a track athlete, as some of you know, you're not just a track athlete, you're a thrower or a jumper or a hurdler or a long distance runner. So he decided she was going to be a hurdler. Okay, now running hurdles is very, very difficult. They are high. You have to figure out a certain pattern of rhythm to jump over them. When they fall, it's loud and it crashes and everybody stops and looks. So this young woman, call her Olivia, is learning to run hurdles. And if I were to play the video, what you would see is the coach is standing there. She goes to run this line of hurdles. She jumps over the first two and the last one falls to the ground and crashes. And she's frustrated and she says, I can't. And the coach says, look here, kid. No, I can't. Look here. You're going to be a hurdler. That was the best you've ever gone over any hurdle. And I'm going to analyze this in a moment. He says, that was the best you've ever gone over any hurdle. Did you feel how much speed you had when you came off? But you have to control that speed. And when you get to the next hurdle, 1, 2, 3, up, out. And he kind of demonstrates with his body the rhythm of the steps. And she says, how many did I have? 4. And she's talking about the number of steps between hurdles. He says, yeah, that's why, you had 4. That's why it went over. That's why the hurdle went over. And she walks back to the line to begin again. And this is a really critical identity moment and lots of interesting things in action. First, she thinks she has failed, right? So when she comes back and says, I can't, she thinks she has failed and the coach reframes her performance. What's important isn't that the hurdle fell down, it's how you went over the hurdles. And this gives her a sense of what are the important aspects of the performance that she needs to attend to: speed, control, body movements. And this feedback is immediate, right? It doesn't wait until 3 weeks later when there's a test. Interesting too, that she participates in this conversation, right? Critiquing her own performance, diagnosing the places of performance, and that she then goes back to get in line again, this repetition, this chance for improvement. And further, he does this identity kind of ascription. You are going to be a hurdler, and ascribes her that identity, thus supporting her in understanding that she will come to learn what she needs to learn to be successful at this. So all this to say, there's some really interesting things. 1, about studying learning environments outside of school. 2, about the ways environments tell you who you can be and what it means to be a learner in this space. So, they have a lot of writing about that. And I'm going to fast forward a bit to say, summarizing over a number of years and bodies of work, my own and other people, most recently myself and Roy P. and Carol Lee and Maxine McKinney-DeRoyston edited this handbook, the Handbook of the Cultural Foundations of Learning. And the handbook is really about, this was 2 years ago, really figuring out where's the cutting edge on what we understand about the cultural nature of learning. It has some wonderful chapters. It's open access, so you can go on and download any of the chapters that you would like. And after we produced this, very thick handbook, we thought, what did we learn about learning? And, in all of these dense academic chapters, we didn't have like a good summary of like, what are the lessons here? So we thought we want to write something that's more publicly facing, that really kind of encapsulates the major arguments. And so we wrote a couple pieces, one in Phi Delta Kappa and one in Ed Researcher, that say, here's kind of what we learned about learning. And as we did that, here's what we came up with. And we call them the RISE principles of learning, which is that learning is rooted in evolutionary, biological, and the neurological systems of our minds and bodies, right? Learning is hardwired. We are born to learn, which is why learning is so pervasive. Learning is integrated with all other aspects of development, cognition, emotion, the formation of identity. You learn in places, you learn more effectively in places where you don't have to fight to belong. You learn more effectively in places where you feel that people care about you and are attentive to your needs. You learn better in places where your identity is aligned with what you're being asked to do there. And so attention to those more psychosocial elements of the learning space are not extra, they're actually fundamental and critical. Learning is shaped by everyday life cultural activities, both in and out of school and across the lifespan, which is just that point about the sea of blue. Learning's happening everywhere. And when we forget that, we lead to ridiculous conclusions like, you know, kids from certain homes aren't literate. Well, of course they're literate. Their literacy may not be showing up on your instrument, but that's a very different kind of problem to have. And finally, learning is experienced in our bodies through coordination with social others. Learning is a fundamentally social activity, and in many ways, a fundamentally embodied and physical activity as well. And there's lots of work to support that. So given these principles, I feel like what I kind of take away is that this social nature of learning is really fundamental. You cannot separate learning from social context, social interaction, emotion, and identity. It happens in the context of cultures and communities. And that part is really important because I think historically we've talked about learning as a cognitive activity. And when you're thinking about why certain kids of color don't learn or why Black kids don't learn, there's something special cultural about their learning. But what the science actually shows is that learning is fundamentally cultural for everyone. And learning also requires faith in getting through the hard parts. It requires enough human connection to persist when things are really challenging and difficult, which is what that track coach knew. He and his wife did sleepovers with the young people so that they were bonded to each other, so that when hard things happen, they stuck with it for each other. Right? It's part of that science. And learning is technical. It's about understanding disciplined ways of thinking and problem solving, sometimes rooted in disciplines like math, science, social studies, literature, and also rooted in the ways of thinking in communities as it's reflected in work like Megan Bang. So we know a lot from the science of learning. We understand learning to be both simple and complex, and most certainly deeply social and cultural, and inherently so. And these truths about learning mean something for the kinds of education systems we need. They help us understand the shortcomings of the systems we have and the conceptual models that those systems were built upon. And I've written elsewhere and focused in other talks on, if we understand learning in this way, how we would design schools and learning systems. So I'm not going to focus on that here. For our purposes today, instead, I want to note that these fundamental understandings about learning, which have really been at the crux of my scholarly career, have led to the work that I'm now doing at the Spencer Foundation and in my other leadership work, and undergird how I think about the collective learning that our field needs to do research that would be more impactful and more transformative to systems of education. And I'm going to turn to these next. Act 2. Act 2 focuses on my leadership learning journey, and more specifically, my work as president of the Spencer Foundation for the last 5.5 years. And I'm going to take up the question here, what does learning have to do with leadership? And this is really, I don't usually talk publicly about the Spencer work, so I'm excited to share what we've been up to publicly. But this is an arc of work and a story of our work that we all know very well, internal to the foundation and among the board. And I chose this picture for the slide intentionally, not because it's a flattering picture of me. It is not, but because I will never forget this moment and what I learned in this moment as a leader. This is during the time that I was the Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion at Berkeley, which was the most amazing and most challenging job I've ever had. And this picture was taken at a campus rally after the Orlando club shootings. And we were working very hard in E&I to hold the students and the staff, especially the LGBTQ community, in love and support. And what was clear to me in that moment, looking out over our campus community, and you see I'm holding my phone and like reading my notes because I was trying to say something that could matter to people who were deeply, deeply hurting. But what was clear to me in that moment was that when one part of our community was hurt, and being attacked from bigotry and hatred, we all were. And that moving together as one and learning to hold and speak all of the hurts, and for us all, even in the face of these hurts, to imagine something better was perhaps the most important part of my job. That how do we hold the challenges of the reality and still move to imagine something better? So leadership then is fundamentally about learning too, right? If racism and colonial processes are about denying the full humanity of whole groups of people for the financial gain of some, then leading for equity is about creating spaces where full humanity can thrive and where loving systems make space for full engagement and the development of potential. And these are the ways of being that we personally and collectively have to grow into. So again, leadership is fundamentally about learning, about individuals learning to be and learning to be in relation to one another in new ways, but also about building learning systems and loving systems that rehumanize institutions and organizations, which is both about the work of building systems in which people can thrive, find joy, do their best work, and about doing outward-facing work that's consequential and has the potential to envision a new future where we all can thrive. So with that bit of kind of context, I'm going to share some about my learning, the learning journey of our work at Spencer. So when I started, it was a bit of a shock to me, and I think a shock to some others, that the board chose me to lead the Spencer Foundation. They'd never had a leader of color. They had not had, Spencer had always had a commitment to equity, but it was a quiet, under the surface commitment. And bringing me on board was a much louder revoicing of that commitment. And the board was ready for that. They were ready to embrace an equity lens with regard to our work. And they wanted me to build on the really strong foundation around rigor that was already there. And specifically, they wanted the foundation to better represent and be inclusive of the range of scholarly communities in the field and to be more expansive about who we funded. And so the first thing that we did was get clear about our mission. So this slide shows where we got to in that work of clarifying our mission. At Spencer, we believe that education research is integral to improving education, making education systems more equitable, and increasing opportunities to learn across the lifespan. So we fund research, but we don't fund research just to be funded research, right? We fund research because that's making a bet that research will help these things happen, making education systems more equitable and increasing opportunities to learn across the lifespan. And that's actually in the history of the foundation documents. Lyle Spencer was kind of an extraordinary, quirky guy. I won't go into the details, but fun to talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. The other thing we did is clarify our core commitments. What kind of research did we want to be funding? And this is what we came up with. We fund research that is rigorous, that is relevant, that is equitable, that is transformative, and that is collaborative. And we strive for that in every corner of our funding. Now, one of the things we came to wrestle with a bit was that, as many of you know, Spencer is field initiated in our funding. We fund across the field in a very ecumenical way. Ed Psych to Ed Reform to history to philosophy to neurolinguistics to like across the full range. And we really take pride in supporting the field on the field's terms. But when we introduced an equity lens and started to think about how are we funding work that moves us towards equitable systems, we had to wrestle a bit with, could the strategy of funding across the field get us there? And what we decided is that funding across the field is deep in the DNA, and that wasn't something we wanted to change. But we decided to build an additional line of work where we were zeroing in on racial equity. So I'm going to say more about kind of the range of things we did, because that outward-facing work required a lot of inward-facing changes to who we were, to our processes, to how we were making grant decisions. So this chart's got a lot on it, but what it tries to encapsulate is the various dimensions on which we kind of dug in order to increase diversity, equity, and belonging, both internal to the foundation and in how we were holding the field. And I always say, my staff get tired of me saying this, you cannot create in the world what you cannot create in your own organization. So these lines of work kind of reflect that internal, external kind of philosophy about our work. And so we asked ourselves a number of questions. With respect to diversity, we asked, how do we ensure diversity at multiple levels in the organization? How do we effectively use data to support this diversification? With respect to equity, we asked, who is privileged by current processes and practices? Who is left out? How does that ultimately impact our funding decisions? With respect to belonging, we asked, what are the ways we message who belongs in the Spencer community and who doesn't? And how do we open up spaces for new ways and new people to belong in the Spencer community? And so we did a number of things. We, first of all, diversified who was leading, who foundation leadership was, who the board was, who the staff were. We, as I mentioned, got clear about our values and our goals. We developed a new kind of data infrastructure to think about who we were funding in decision meetings. So there's a moment where we stop and we say, if these are our grantees, how does this reflect the field? And we did a bunch of external facing work. We rebuilt the website. You should go to it. It's lovely. And it's intended to represent the work that we do, the heart and the spirit and the soul of that work, and to message the multiple communities that we see ourselves as serving. And we also did a couple things. We opened up. I always felt like the foundation kind of existed without a lot of transparency behind a curtain, if you will. We opened the curtain and we now do office hours with program staff. So if you're a potential grantee and you want to ask a question of a program staff, you can go online, sign up for office hours and kind of have access. We also redesigned our space internally. So we did a renovation in 2020 that allows us to now hold convenings of up to 60 people. And our space now reflects who we are. I should have put up some pictures. It's beautiful and gorgeous. And it reminds us of our mission every single day and reminds others of our mission when they come and visit our space. And we did a bunch of things about our grant making. We changed who we were asking to review proposals. We changed the review criteria that we were using. We moved to providing feedback to 100% of people who sent in a viable proposal. Prior to that, we were giving feedback to about the top 30% of proposals. So if you were the people furthest from the mark of getting the grants, were the least likely to get feedback. And we made it our mission to make sure that if you submitted a grant proposal, you will get feedback on what worked about it and what didn't work about it. And you're able to take that feedback and revise. And we see that as our commitment to building the capacity of the field to write really stellar proposals. And we produced some public facing resources, some grant writing guides, webinars. So we're trying to be more open about what we're looking for and what our processes are. And then we also reflected that work on our investment side. And people talk about this in philanthropy as the other 95%, because what you spend is 5% of the endowment, right? That's what you're spending on grant making in any given year. But that means that 95% of the funds that are held in a foundation are held in investments. Where is that money invested? Is it invested in ways that are aligned with our mission? Or is it invested in the market without thinking about that kind of alignment? So we've embarked upon a whole journey around our investment side that, again, I can say more about in the Q&A, as well as our vendors, our HR practices. So really weaving equity throughout our organization. So I wanted to share just a couple of things. This shows the changes in our board and staff diversity from 2017 to current. And you'll see big changes. We changed who we hired. We changed who we asked to come to our board. Still lots of work to do, but we moved the needle pretty significantly in those few years. We also embarked upon a racial equity initiative in 2020, which involved 3 strategies: commissioning new work, convening people in new ways, and collaborating within and with scholars and with philanthropy in new ways as well. And again, I can talk more about that. But that led us to the kind of set of things that we're working on now around funding transformative research. And we commissioned a set of white papers, which you can find on our website, really amazing papers by stellar scholars on various aspects of racial equity in research. And all of this did change allowed us to change who we were funding. So this graph is small, but it shows the change in the race and ethnicity of applicants. That's applicants, not the grantees, but it's similar over the course of that time. And this basically shows that we invited new people to consider being funded by Spencer, and they did. There's another graph that I should have put in here instead of this one that shows who we actually funded changed as well. And the lines look a little similar, a little more drastic. So all that to say, we've been on this journey and have accomplished some things, and it's not where we're ending. And I feel like in some ways it has allowed us to build to this place where we can now think about where we're supporting the field of education research to go. And that takes us to Act 3. Where should the field of education research be headed? And what do we need to learn collectively to get there? I will argue that where we need to be headed is in that box on the left, research as a tool for liberation. And I'm going to be unapologetic about that. And what that means to me is that research needs to be a part of the solution, a part of creating education systems where people find freedom and joy and the ability to actualize their full potential. And what that requires is that our research be centered in equity, both with respect to our research process and systems level outcomes. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. And that we are working in ways where we are conducting research with people and not on people. That means deeper collaborations with communities. That means constructing research questions with the people who are actually wrestling with those things in the world at the table, and to engage in research that seeks to create new possibility. Research, and sometimes in particular equity research, spends a lot of energy analyzing what's going wrong. A lot of time thinking about what is causing inequity. And we need to spend more, we need to do that for sure, because we need to understand those things. But we also need to be thinking about what new possibilities do we need to create and how do we do that? And we need to be doing work that is asset-based and not deficit-based, that is rooted in a sense of the strength of young people, of families, of communities, not research that tries to ameliorate problems that are happening for families, students, and communities. So I want to dive in a little bit on my last bit of time on that, what it means to center equity in research. And I argue that there are 3 aspects to centering equity in research. One has to do with content. What do we study and how do we frame it? Another has to do with process. To what extent are we conducting our research as researchers in equitable ways? And the third has to do with impact. Are we doing work in ways that best supports equitable change in education and learning systems? And I want to say a bit about each of those things. With respect to content, as a field, I argue that we need to move away from viewing learning as a one-size-fits-all, involving a linear path, and move towards viewing learning as involving many pathways, trajectories, and experiences. We need to move away from research designs that stop at documenting inequities and move towards research designs that support the imagining and building of new practices and systems. We need to move away from framing families, communities, and young people as being in deficit and working to fix them, and move towards building on the existing strengths and legacies of families, communities, and young people. And we need to move away from measuring outcomes in highly constrained ways and at individual levels only, and move towards measuring multidimensional and whole people outcomes, focusing on inputs and systems. With respect to process, we need to move away from siloing divergence and disconnection, by which I mean researchers doing their work alone using narrow lenses and methods, and move towards collaboration, interdisciplinarity, integration, and move with a deeper respect for and processes to learn from and with families, communities, teachers, and other stakeholders. We need to move away from overemphasis on intervention models and scaling, and move towards a focus on possibility, ecological context, and heterogeneity. And we need to move away from short-term and small-scale studies only and move towards more ambitious studies with longer terms and wider scopes. And finally, with respect to impacts, We need to move away from focusing on findings from individual studies. What do I know from my research? And move towards focusing on field level findings. What do we know from the body of research? That is what policymakers, practitioners, stakeholders need from our community. What do we know? Which means we have to conceptualize our work as building on one another as a whole field. We need to move away from impact as an afterthought, what Linda Darling Hammond calls throwing the findings over the wall and hoping someone catches them, right? And move towards impact as built in from the beginning of the research process. How you scope the topic, how you communicate throughout the process of the research, how you're building relationships and moving in consultation from the very beginning. And we need to move away from research training that fails to teach the multitude of necessary skills and orientations for collaboration and impact, and develop new models of research training that will help us as a field lean into these ways of doing research. And we are super excited about supporting the field and moving in these directions. And we'll be announcing some new programs this spring that we hope will help get us there. And so I want to end with some lines from one of my favorite poems. It's a poem called "For My People" by Margaret Walker, because I think it encapsulates the kind of hope and forward movement that we need in the field and that we need as a nation right now. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that all made sense and wasn't too disjointed, and open for, and my timer goes off right then, and open for questions. And I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.
Wow. So very clear. Thank you, Dr. Nasir, Naila. Not just hopeful, but you've charted a pathway for how together we can get there. So just wonderful. Dr. Brian Williams, do we have questions?
We do. So Joyce, can we start with some questions, maybe a conversation with you and Dr. Nasir, and then we'll shoot you some questions.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say to Dr. Nasir, we have to share a little bit more because my family is from Shreveport too. We might be cousins.
We might be cousins.
So I'll just be candid. I think you've given us a very transparent, accessible entree into the wonderful and powerful work that you've been doing. I kind of have a triggering moment when I think about field, because my family came up in the fields with a different kind of relationship to knowledge and education and all of that. So I'm wondering, what is the significance of contextualizing education research as a field? What is it that we're communicating about the work that we do? Why is that something that's important? Are we trying to say that we're as good as the psychologists or the physicists? What is this field significance?
Wow, that's a great question. So I have a thing about that. Like, I feel like academic fields, whether it be psychology in the 1950s or education in the 1990s, we spend a lot of time trying to be good enough, right? Like in some ways, there's like an individual human mirror in there. And I think education has suffered from that trying to be good enough, because we wanted to be social sciencey. And so we did things that social scientists do, and we shied away from the applied parts of our work.
Okay.
And So I guess I'll say one. I don't mean anything in particular by the term field other than to say all of us. And it actually should be fields, I suppose.
Ah,
Because,
okay.
education, learning sciences, like I don't, people take their professional identities very seriously. And part of what I'm trying to say is, yes, education, yes, political science, yes, psychology, yes, history. So when I say the field, I'm kind of including everybody who's interested in studying education. That's what that means to me. But I also think it means, as folks sitting in education schools in particular, that we stop worrying so much about being theoretical enough, and we worry a lot more about being useful.
And the
And
impact, yes.
the impact, yeah. I think that has to be really, really at central, really at the center of what we're doing.
So I have one other question before Brian opens us up to the Q&A. That slide that you showed, that education research is a tool for liberation. That's pretty, not just unapologetic, it's pretty revolutionary to be using that language wherever we are in our fields.
Yeah.
Is equity liberation?
Girl,
See, you had to
no,
go.
equity is not liberation. But and there's this thing about the terms is super interesting, right? So when I think I use the word liberation there instead of equity, because what I'm wanting to signal is there's a deeper, almost like spiritual part to what it means, to what we're after in education. That education isn't just about people achieving the same things or having the same, social economic outcomes. It's about those things. Like, education should be a social mobility engine for sure, but it should be also a way we come to know ourselves, and the way we come to know ourselves individually and collectively. And so liberation gets at those pieces better for me. I was talking recently with John Powell, who uses these terms, othering and belonging, and he uses them in a pretty radical way. Like, he would argue that no, we shouldn't be using equity, we should be using belonging, and we should be creating a society where everyone fundamentally belongs. And if we can do that, the questions that we consider under equity would actually kind of then be irrelevant. So I think there are lots of other ways to think about it, and equity is kind of a term we have used as a shortcut to some of those other things, and as something that has been probably more publicly palatable than a term like liberation. But your work was on the cutting edge always of saying things in ways that the world didn't think we should say them, right? And so I think
I came up in the fields.
in the fields and in the fields.
Right. But I do want to, we're in Georgia, and I do want to remind us and the audience that saying equity, for some people, is a bad word.
Well, it's been politicized to be a bad word, intentionally so.
Thank you.
Like, it's been that was a concerted movement to turn it into a word that signals some things. The same thing like SEL. How did SEL become a politicized term? That didn't make any sense. Like that's a term that's like, oh, that's a, so I think we're in a moment around equity work. And it's part of why I am still using that term really intentionally, because I don't want to cede the power to those that are wanting to redefine it as something that has to do with that is actually the way they're trying to redefine it to mean exactly the opposite of what we mean when we use it. That it's about moving to a society where we all belong, where we all can achieve, where we all can thrive. And I actually don't think there are that many people in this nation and around this globe that don't want that, right? Like, I think there's a minority for sure, but that intentional reframing of terms like equity is partly designed to convince us that we don't all want the same thing,
divide and conquer.
Yes.
It's part
Yes.
of the capturing of the narrative, and then, it's sort of, I use the analogy of the alien, when that thing
Right.
gets inside of you and you don't know it's there.
Right,
So-
right. But it's why, for me, like equity work at its fundamental core is about humanity. It's about respecting and honoring other people's humanity. Oppression is about denying humanity intentionally for financial gain,
Mhm.
right? And so when we're honoring and holding people's humanity as central, that's what we're after.
Right. Okay. I see something in the chat from Nadia for Dr. Nasir. Thank you for your energy and insights this evening. I'm wondering what you would say are the most pressing problems and promising possibilities right now in the field of educational research. In other words, what research study or studies would you be thrilled to see? Oh, Nadia, you trying to get ahead of the game.
Well, I'll say this. I was talking with students this morning, and one of the things I said is I haven't been like a practicing academic really for 5 years. So I don't necessarily have a dog in this fight. But I will say I am seeing some thrilling work from the field and from scholars, folks who are thinking about building learning ecosystems at the city level and thinking about how young people are having access to various types of learning opportunities between in school and out of school at a city level. I'm seeing work that looks at segregation and integration policies and the effectiveness of those policies across different types of municipalities, and studies that look at what we should be doing around creating better integrated neighborhoods and schools. I'm seeing work that looks at kind of legacies of indigeneity in higher education and what it means to create new possibilities for belonging on university and community college campuses. I'm seeing lots of new forms of partnership, and people developing methodologies and collaborative processes that really deeply lean into learning from communities in new kinds of ways. So I think there's a lot that's really thrilling. The methodological work that takes quantitative methods, but with a critical lens to look at some of these problems and challenges. There's some really great work happening in assessment and measurement, right? To think differently about what we're measuring and how, and maybe we think about measurement not as looking at individuals who achieve things, but systems that make things available to be learned. So I think we're at a really kind of almost like a renaissance time in our field. And these young scholars coming through are like brilliant with so much fierceness and integrity about their work. Like that is incredibly thrilling to me to see the work that's coming out from younger scholars in our fields.
Thank you. We have another question from Mina. Lots of work is centered in urban settings. What is the state of interest and equity in innovation in rural communities?
Yeah, I think there's some amazing work happening in rural right now. We actually just funded a community of rural scholars who are thinking about rural. When you say rural, people think like Appalachian white folks, which that's rural for sure. But there are also indigenous folks on reservations. There are migrant workers in the Southwest that live in rural communities. There are Black folks in the South in rural communities. And so this group of scholars is working across those communities and really rethinking what rural means and how it's defined and the kind of things that we study in rural education. So I think there's some really amazing work happening in rural. And I feel like sometimes as the president of Spencer, the question I get most often and that my program staff get most often is, do you fund things on X? Name a topic, usually whatever topic that scholar happens to be working on. And the answer is always yes. Yes. It's a beautiful thing about being field initiated. We fund that, all of it, but it needs to be rigorous. It needs to be methodologically tight. It needs to be well argued. And right now what we're prioritizing is work that's going to that has the sight line to impact, and that's working closely with the people for whom you're seeking to have impact are actually involved in the design of the work that you're proposing.
Ah, okay, that's critical. That's a critical what impact means. That's a little more than just doing something on people, but it goes back to your point about research with the people who are experiencing whatever the issues are. Okay, we have another question from Justice. Research as a tool for liberation is so powerful. I like also to think of research in service of rather than a service to. I wonder, though, how we achieve this in scholarly communities that believe equity and social justice is a U.S. issue. I find this a lot in communities that deem themselves international, as if we are the only ones with issues.
Yes, plus one to that. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I think obviously anybody who studies education and is an awake and aware human knows that these are global issues. Anti-Blackness is global. It's why when the US went crazy after George Floyd with protests, the world went crazy with protests. Like that was insight if you were looking, right? And what it says is this experience of oppression is global. Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks are experiencing this across the world, not just in the United States, which makes sense because colonialism was global. And so I think your point there is exactly right and well taken. And we do need to be doing more work that looks at these issues, not just in US context, which some ways limits our imagination, but also in global context. Because the other thing you see is that, you know, Brazil looks very different with respect to how it nationally is taking up issues of race, right? And that arc of like, we don't talk about race, we're not gonna talk about it at all. We don't see it, we don't have to, oh, maybe we do need to think about this a little more intentionally, and all the activism and protests that went into that arc in Brazil. Like there's some really important lessons there. And I do think I've also been, what I thought of when you were saying the question was spaces that I've been in European nations in particular, where folks say, oh, well, yeah, the US has big race problems and we don't have that here, but all you got to do is pull aside a person of color in that country.
Right.
And they'll be like, oh yeah,
The
all the
taxi
time.
man.
So, you know, we do know that not talking about issues of race and oppression does not make them disappear. That we know for sure.
So thank you again. We have a question from John. I'm not sure I'm going to get this right, but I'll try. A lovely talk, first of all. So inspired. It seems you are ready to consider useful sites of research as perhaps necessarily taking place other than within or under the control of higher education.
Ooh, yes. Well, you're going to push the envelope, John. I appreciate that. There's another thing I think I'm seeing just in the terrain, both in Chicago specifically and nationally, is folks in communities building and developing research institutes. And that has a long history. That's not new per se, but I think there's a new iteration of it happening where people are saying, parents themselves can be researchers and help us understand what young people need in schools. And we can do this in a nonprofit outside of the auspices of a university. Now, I love universities. I'm deeply committed to universities. So just to say, but I also do think amazing, beautiful, impactful research happens lots of different places. And there's a thing about our historic commitment to elitism is it makes you a bit tunnel vision so that you can't see the wonderful research that's happening in lots of places. One of the things I didn't talk about that I have a lot to say about is the way in which we have included institutional diversity as a key goal at Spencer, which is to say we do not want to just be funding the top, the most elite and well-funded universities. We want to be funding scholars in universities and colleges across the nation, including MSIs, HBCUs, lots of community colleges, all kinds of contexts. And we've been very intentional to name that as an element of diversity that we look at across our slate. So when we're at the end of a decision meeting and we say, okay, who have we funded? And if there's not enough institutional diversity, we go back. Okay, what are we doing? What are we doing wrong? We've been doing concerted outreach to institutions that we don't normally fund. We actually have done analyses with our database to say, where are the institutions who have applied for funding at Spencer and been unsuccessful? Where are the institutions that have actually never applied? And going to those places and talking to scholars and telling them about our programs. And this is where our decision to move to 100% feedback really matters, because if you're in an institution where you do not have networks, like I always tell the story, when I was at Stanford, I got a Spencer postdoc. Well, sure I did. We had a file of proposals from people who had gotten Spencer postdocs, which we shared with each other. And so there was a network that taught us how to write these things. If you're in a university without that same network, how do you learn these things? And so that's why the feedback becomes really, really important, so that the application process itself becomes a learning mechanism.
And a liberating mechanism, because you're like,
Right.
shining the light on how to go about this. That's really encouraging and hopeful. We have a question from Lisa B. In terms of framing and design, can you say more about the design of research that supports the imagining and building of new practices and systems, and moving away from merely documenting inequities?
Yes, and we are working on, this is our running joke, is that we're after like transformative research, and yet we struggle internally to find examples of what we mean by that. So we're like, well, do you have an example? Let's go back in the files and find. So we are committed to a set of examples that we are going to provide for the field around this.
Oh,
but
great.
I will say there are folks doing this kind of work. And I think what we mean is, it is one thing to say, for instance, that standardized assessments reify inequalities. And we know that when, and they both punish teachers and push them, like there's a lot of research that tells you the effects, but there's less that says, what are the alternatives? How could we be assessing students in ways that are perhaps more formative, or that are summative, but get more at the local ecology of what's being taught? Or how is the data we're gathering about what students know used? Because it could be used to punish teachers, or it could be used to think about new types of learning and training opportunities, professional development opportunities for teachers. It could be used to make arguments about why we need teachers to have an expanded view of human development, of culture, we're not using it in that way. And so what we mean then is framing research questions that take up the questions around what new possibilities exist here, and with whom could we design these possibilities. And this is why having folks other than researchers at the table is so important. And we've been hosting convenings at Spencer where we bring scholars, and usually across discipline, around a key issue or challenge. And we also invite policymakers, folks that were congressional staffers, or that are in the Department of Ed, or who are state level curriculum folks. And we invite practitioners, teachers, principals, superintendents. And in that room, we have conversations around what's the cutting edge of research? What are the challenges that need to be taken up and solved? What are the opportunities that are existing in the policy and practice worlds right now that researchers need to be aware of? And it's those kinds of conversations that can lead us to understanding more deeply how we're framing, so that we're building new practices and systems, and not only describing the problems with current practices and systems. And I think I said this to you when we talked earlier, Joyce, like I've had this epiphany a couple of years ago where it was like, if scholars are not at the edge of reimagining systems, who in our society is going to do this work? We get whole paid to think. Like, nobody has that luxury. And so we gotta take advantage of that freedom that we have to make ourselves agents of possibility.
Okay, your answers are so eloquent. The next question is from Vincent W. You are doing fantastic work at the Spencer Foundation. Are there any plans for Spencer to fund specific projects at the primary and secondary level?
We do it, yeah, every day. Like in all of our programs, we're funding at the primary and secondary level. So from large grants to conference grants to research practice partnership grants, our small grants program. So and in our annual report, which you could find online, another thing we started doing. I think we started in 2020, an annual report that's fully transparent about what we have funded and what topics we funded, what levels of education we funded, who the grantees are, what reviewers we've utilized over the course of the year, how much money we've given away. So you can find all of that in our annual report. I think the most recent one is the 2021 report that went up a few months ago.
So I'll just insert a question here while others are coming up. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but you've been with us here in Atlanta virtually, but you've had a chance to engage with people from many different sectors. And as you think about, like, if you had come here physically and now you're leaving and going back to Chicago and to the Spencer Foundation, is there anything you're taking away with you about our context, about Georgia, about the South, about the legacies of struggle and imagination that come out of this place? And you started with Benjamin Mays and the wonderful example that he has left with us, from spirituality to fortitude and perseverance. And I think of the role as a leader that he played when he advised the Atlanta students who were involved in protesting racism and desegregation. He didn't tell them not to do that, as other presidents were, telling students you're going to be suspended or expelled. Instead, he told them to publish their statement in the newspaper, and it became a clarion call for human rights. So we have those traditions here. What are you taking away with you from this day with us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm leaving inspired. I had a chance to meet with folks who were doing great work in community and nonprofit organizations, who were thinking about research in new ways, were thinking about data in new ways, who are working from very in close collaboration with communities around important social issues. I had a chance to meet with students and hear about the amazing things they're working on. We talked about a twist out. I mean, we had a wide ranging conversation. So I'm leaving with a sense of inspiration from the people, and also just a sense of region, like how important region is to our theoretical frames, to our methodologies, to how we think about collaboration, and almost like a healthy new respect for region and and what's special about the South as a region.
Thank you. We have one last question. I got to take my glasses off to see these. Okay. I can choose, and I choose Lauren's question. Considering recent legislation in many states seeking to suppress research related to race, racism, oppression, and injustice, how do you suggest that scholars doing work on issues of educational inequity protect themselves and their research topics?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially right now. And I will say we've been thinking a lot about this and working a lot on this with other foundations, with groups of scholars. There's a lot of activity happening in the philanthropic world around how we support that protection. And we've been in conversation with lots of different folks about that. I guess I will say first and foremost, you have to protect yourself and your family, right? And to be unapologetic about that. The tactics that are being used are vicious and they're harmful. And so very pragmatic things like making sure your personal address information is not accessible on the web, and making sure that you are in an institution where you have support from your dean, from your colleagues, from your university, should one of these attacks turn its lens on you. But I will say as a collective, I think we push forward. This is the work we know we need to be doing. The reason why this backlash is happening is because the work is so important and so consequential. And so as foundations, as universities, as university leadership, I think we have to stand behind and in front of folks who are doing this really important work, because we can afford to take the shots, right? We can afford to take the hits. And that is an appropriate role for us to take. And I think we can't display fear in the face of this moment. We have to stand in what's fundamentally right.
Well, thank you very much. That's saying a lot. Thank you so much, Dr. Nasir. So that was one of two, Brian. Are we moving on to the next part of the program?
We are, and thank you to Dr. Nasir, thank you, Dr. King, and thank you once again to our community of leaders for being with us. At this point, Dr. Nasir will be another thunderous applause, standing ovation, and then we would quiet and I would introduce Timothy Krim, who is the son of Dr. Alonzo Krim. So the tradition for May's lecture is that the family of Alonzo Krim always has an opportunity to speak, and usually they close us out with some words of encouragement, some words of hope, and thank you to our lecturer. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Timothy Krim.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Williams, and Provost Parson Pollard, Dean Alberto, Dr. King, and Dr. Nasir. By the grace of God, I am here this evening, but very honored and humbled, and I just extend my deepest appreciation to you for the opportunity and the invitation to participate in such a wonderful and historic occasion, I'll say. And it is a delight for me to represent the Krim family and relatives. And I'd like to take just a personal moment and opportunity to acknowledge our first granddaughter that was born. And we are so happy about that, but also acknowledge my sisters, Dr. Sharon Krim, a retired educator, and my late sister and former Georgia State Krim Center Director, Dr. Susan Krim McClendon. And Dr. Williams, I want to apprise everyone that Susan's husband, Willie McClendon, and family members have established a scholarship in her name. And along with my wife, Donna Krim, and I and family, we've initially funded the Alonzo A. Krim and Gwendolyn M. Krim scholarship at Georgia State. And we are just so happy and thankful. And it is our hope that all of you will join us in an annual effort to contribute and identify scholars as well as researchers to further develop the ambitions of urban educational excellence here at GSU. But you know, it's interesting as I was listening, and I'm reminded of the times spent with Dr. Mays and Dr. Krim when they would meet at our house after Board of Education meetings, and not realizing the full significance and the historical impact at the time of talking with them. But they would discuss leadership strategies and strategies with goals and really a vision to produce practitioner researchers and teacher leaders. And the idea was that they would create both practical solutions as well as theoretical knowledge. And I know now that their objectives really were a form of collaborative engaged scholarship and really capability development, which is just so essential, as we've been told, to meet the transformational challenges facing urban schools and students, and most of all, our communities. I was in awe then, and I'm in awe tonight from the message and insights, and particularly the call to action that Dr. Mays and Dr. Krim would give us concerning the common equity of humanity. And I can think of what Dr. Mays once said, that equality of education opportunity is necessary for true American citizenship, as defined by the US Constitution, the religious gospels, and the American dream. And Dr. Krim believed that every person in the community is a stakeholder in public education and has a vested interest in the quality of learning in the public educational system. And the idea is that that creates opportunities for all children in the community to learn, achieve, and develop. And that was the basis of his network of community. And so tonight, it is very clear that we've enjoyed a wonderful and inspirational and historic experience. Thank you, Dr. Nasir, for just informing us with your insightful research and just powerful lessons of lifelong and life-wide learning leadership. And this idea of linking research and civic community and equity responsibility. And it's just inspired us all, as Dr. King has said. So Dr. Nasir, you clearly represent the spirit of educational excellence of Dr. Benjamin Mays and Dr. Alonzo Krim, reflecting the mission of the Alonzo A. Krim Center, which is to optimize life opportunities of children and families in urban communities throughout and through community engagement, research, and educational development and support. So on behalf of Georgia State University, Provost Parson Pollard, Dr. Alberto, Dr. King, and Dr. Williams, the Georgia State University Alonzo A. Krim Center for Urban Education Excellence will send to you, normally presenting, but send to you an acknowledgement of appreciation and gratitude for being the 34th Benjamin E. Mays Lecturer. Just thank you, thank you, thank you so very much. Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you so much. And with that, another Mays lecture has come to a close. We want to thank you for being with us tonight. And once again, to thank our lecturer, Dr. Naila Nasir, for sharing her ideas, her radical vision for our future and the world that we seek to create. The next thing you'll hear from us will be information about the Sources Conference, so keep your ears and eyes open, and have a blessed and safe night. Good night.